Alejandro Armellini, ki je profesor in dekan Digital and Distributed Learning področja v Univerzi v Portsmouthu v Združenem kraljestvu. Alejandro, I hope that you are with us.
I am indeed.
Yes, we hear you.
Good.
Just a second to get your picture on the Zoom. Yes, we see you. We see you. We would like just to see your presentation.
Yeah, I will share it in a moment. It is being shared now.
Okay. Just a second. Yes, we see it. So, Professor Alejandro Armellini, I hope that I pronounced your name and surname right. Please, the floor is yours. We are looking for a presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, colleagues. A big thank you to you all for inviting me to play a role in your event this morning, and I hope that I'll give you a few items and a few elements, food for thought, for you to consider, not just during this event, but beyond it, and in your practice as we enter what we hope is a post-COVID period. I called the presentation Active Blended Learning at Scale, and I hope that as we progress with the presentation, you will familiarize yourselves with some of the key concepts that surround the notion of active blended learning. So I've got a little plan for you, which begins with a few principles, followed by what probably happened in the case of my institutions pre-COVID. After that, we'll move on to the pandemic period, and then we're going to reflect on post-COVID scenarios. So to get started with some principles, just a thought that some of these things might be obvious and might be features of your standard practice, others might be different or even controversial. So please feel free to, when we get to the Q&A, feel free to react to any of these, ask, comment as you see appropriate. So a few things to consider here as principles. As American writer Bill Sinzer used to say, the best way to write is to rewrite. Well, the best way to design for effective learning is to redesign. And that applies to courses and modules that work very well as to those who don't work very well. Always a good way to put learners at the heart of the learning process is to think again at what we design and redesign it. Secondly, the second point is about engagement, and engagement has been and continues to be a significant element in our practice as higher education tutors, and we tend to forget sometimes our own role as engaged practitioners. So the point here is, if we want visible, active and engaged learners, well, we need to be visible, active and engaged tutors, regardless of mode of study. Thirdly, we seem to have an obsession as academics with content. And I hear colleagues say, what matters is my content. Students love my content. What they actually mean is, I love my own content. So I invite you to think away from that notion of content is king, and instead consider the role of context. The rationale for that is what matters is not really the content itself, but what learners do with it, why they do it, how they do it, and who they do it with. So again, content isn't king, context is. The next principle is about good teaching, and you will see that there are many units of digital learning, digital innovation, and this and that and the other, transformation and so on. What my point here is rather basic. If you want meaningful and purposeful technology adoption, good teaching practice is a pretty good starting point. Let's not put the cart before the horses. Good teaching goes first. And finally, my fifth and final point is we can do many things with learning, on learning, about learning, but we cannot deliver it. So when you hear terms like deliver learning, please question it, challenge it. However hard you try, you cannot deliver it. That's my final point. And from here, from these principles, we can elicit, we can infer a number of other thoughts and perhaps other principles, some inspired in rather old sayings and statements. So, for example, this is a tweaked version of one of them. Those who can, teach. Those who can't, just deliver content. So this is aimed at practices that simply revolve around standing up and talking at students. Let's not do that. Let's teach our students. That's a different animal altogether. This is the sort of thing we don't want to do. We don't want to carry content from the notes of the teacher to the notes of the students without going through the brains of either. We really need to do better than this. We need to do better than that. That's what I mean by avoiding the stand up and spout approach. Another reflection that emerges necessarily is technology enhanced learning, a very used and abused term in recent years and probably in recent decades. However, if you think about it, we get so worked up and obsessed about things like technology enhanced learning, and yet we don't talk about more basic things like pencil enhanced learning, book enhanced learning, Blackboard enhanced learning. Why? Why are we so crazy about digital technologies? Are they perhaps being oversold to us and to our students? To think about. We use a rather old but very powerful, in my opinion, definition of active learning. Usually when we think of active learning, we think doing, and often we forget about thinking about what we do. So I'm using this definition here just to remind ourselves that active learning has those two sides to that coin, doing and thinking about what we do. Before COVID, I used to work at another university, the University of Northampton in the East Midlands of England. I was Dean of Learning and Teaching there. I worked at that university between 2012 and 2020. And I thought I would very briefly summarize some of the key contributions that we made at that university in the space of ABL, or active blended learning. So to cut a long story short, ABL initially looked a bit like this. On the left, It was very much a case of joining together, not the content on its own, which is, as we said before, not what really matters, but what students do with the content, which is critically the sense-making part of this diagram. Active blended learning is about doing and thinking, and making sense is central to that process. That's what the diagram shows here as the scaffold. That happens in and outside the classroom. It happens individually and in groups. It happens synchronously and asynchronously. You will notice that this slide does not contain words like online or offline. It just talks about how learners take ownership of concepts, of notions, of content. How do they do that? Through the creation, through the design and redesign of sense-making activities. That scaffold extends itself into a more typical face-to-face setting, whether that's the seminar room, the lecture theatre, the lab, the studio, or other learning spaces. And then it extends further into the consolidation phase, which can happen in a variety of learning settings. Now, as academics, we tend to dislike blocky, rigid diagrams like this. So there is a second version, a more evolved version of this, which looks like that. The concepts are indeed the same. Activities at the top, taking center stage, and the rest of the elements provide the scaffold for learners to take ownership and to make sense of what they are doing in collaboration with their peers and with their tutors. In the last 25 years, 30 years, we've been talking about blended learning, and many authors, particularly in the early 2000s, have talked about blended learning being the combination of face-to-face and online learning. Again, colleagues, if you take one thing away from today's session, I invite you to consider this. Walk away from this definition. This is no more. This is old hat. This is gone. It went a long time ago, but people continue to use this, in my view, rather nonsensical definition of face-to-face and online for blended. Think again, is my invitation to you. Reflect again and consider other options. Consider the multi-layered nature of blended learning and active blended learning in particular. Consider the more messy, the more exciting, the more student-centered elements of this, not just the mode of study. The blend can be construed around a number of dimensions, and these are some of them. Not all of them, some of them. Yes, I've got a location element, if you like, online, face-to-face there as one of the dimensions, but there's a lot more. In particular, these days, synchronous, asynchronous is a key element. How do we balance those ways, those forms of interaction of the three types: learner, tutor, learner, content, in real time, synchronously, or in their own time, asynchronously? Are we talking about courses that focus purely on academic matters, or are we talking about courses that focus on more practical employability related issues? Are we running a course that is primarily step-by-step guided, or is it primarily based on independent learning? There are many other dimensions that we can consider. I invite you, colleagues, to reflect on this and again move away from the standard, old-fashioned, frankly abused definition of blended learning as the simplistic combination of face-to-face and online. At my previous university, at my current one thing that helped us a lot to be on the same page with our colleagues and across the institution is to have an agreed definition of what we mean by these things. So you can talk for ages about what blended learning is or is not, but you have to find an agreed position, ideally an institutional position on what ABL, active blended learning, is. So at my previous institution, we had this, and this helped us throughout the transformation and redesign process, which involved all courses and modules. It helped us a lot to bring people with us in the process of change. So ABL is a pedagogical approach that combines sense making with interactions of the different types in a range of learning settings. You will notice that the definition is deliberately flexible to incorporate, to include multiple teaching practices. There isn't a single one thing that is or isn't ABL. Many practices can fit within that definition. This helped us a lot there, and it also helped us a lot at Portsmouth, where I work now. At Portsmouth, we call ABL, we call it blended and connected. And again, blended and connected learning is Portsmouth's approach to learning and teaching, which means that students engage with their studies in those three ways listed in those bullet points. Again, top of the list is through activities. What matters is what learners do with content, not the content itself. Those activities enable them to take ownership of new concepts, critique them, feed forward in a process that occurs in a range of learning settings, not just in the classroom or lab, but also elsewhere. So this is what we mean by blended and connected. Again, multiple practices can fit within this definition. If you want to read more on this, you will find a range of references there, and the conference organizers will have a copy of this for you to access. Moving on with my plan, the pandemic presented a number of challenges, as we all painfully know. I briefly want to refer to the pivot to emergency remote teaching, ERT. And then I'll move on quickly to the digital success plan at the University of Portsmouth, just to give you a flavor of that. The pivot to ERT implied that, or meant for us, remember I was at my previous university, that active blended learning work, all the work that we'd done on that before, gave us an unexpected level of preparation for this shift. So when we had to shift to a full online approach, ABL had given us a leg up, as we say in English, an unexpected help to get us to where we needed to be overnight. It generated what we call the emergency professional development, or EPD. We had to put on a number of workshops for staff to get to grips with the things that they didn't know very much about, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of how you teach at a distance in a fully online environment. And things would have been rather painful without the ABL preparation, as other universities found out. Let me stress again through a graphic here. My apologies, the graphic is in Spanish. but I think this is an opportunity for you to practice your Spanish, if nothing else. 1970, it says, I will dictate my notes. 1990, I will give you photocopies of my notes. 2010, I will give you my notes on a PowerPoint slide. And 2019, I will share my notes on a drive. The technology changes, the teacher-centeredness, content-centric approach doesn't. This is the sort of thing we need to tackle. Many tutors in higher education, in fact, the vast majority of tutors in higher education are not trained teachers. They learn about teaching as they teach, and this is well established in the literature. What emergency remote teaching meant was a sudden opportunity to learn about pedagogy. And this is interesting, and it is important that we capitalize on this and we take these lessons learned forward into the post-COVID period. Three ways in which we can tackle change in a higher education setting. Something happens, we react to it. That's the top bit, responsive, reactive. Slow burn, much more culturally driven change, bottom left, developmental, incremental, change within the culture. And crazy ideas, left field ideas that sometimes we wish to test, pilot, and implement, radical, innovative, bottom right. They interact in different ways. But the key point that I would like to make to you is that when something on the periphery, an idea on the periphery does seem to work, then it is our role as educators and as higher education practitioners to bring those ideas from the periphery into the mainstream, into the center. So let's stop running niche, tiny experiments. When those experiments work, we've got to bring them into the mainstream. We've got to turn those lessons learned for a few into lessons learned for the many. And that's what the new business as usual refers to in this diagram. Where does ABL fit? Well, active blended learning started on the overlap between developmental, incremental, and radical innovative. And as time passed, the process took over 6 years. As time passed, those niche innovations became part of the mainstream, and it therefore moved from the periphery to the center. What about emergency remote teaching and emergency professional development? Well, I would argue that they're still there. They haven't really been normalized in the way that ABL was at Northampton and elsewhere. What about blended and connected at Portsmouth? Well, the intention clearly is to put it there. Is it there at the moment? Not quite. We hope it will be, as we embark on a very ambitious redesign process that will again include the entire portfolio. In order to do just that, we have created and extensively consulted on our digital success plan for learning and teaching 2021 to 25. The purpose of which is to develop a blended and connected ecosystem and culture that support inspirational teaching and transformational learning for all our students. That's what the plan is about. It's built around what we call the 6P framework. Fortunately, Portsmouth also begins with a P, so we've got 7 in total. But there you've got key elements of the plan. So prospect is, if you like, the vision, graduates for life, portfolio, the courses we offer, partnerships with students working with us as a partnership, place, physical and virtual campuses, principles for practice, pedagogy for participation. Those are the pillars of the 6P framework. The plan has 5 aims, and I would argue that the key ones for today's purposes are A1 and A2. A1 is about redesign. A2 is about redesigning assessments. A3 is about growing our online provision. A4 is about giving our learners more credit-bearing learning opportunities outside of their degrees. And A5 is essentially about learning analytics. Do we want to return to normal? No. If by normal we mean what was happening before the pandemic, no, that's not what we want. That would mean throwing away a lot of excellent lessons learned in the last 2 years. We don't want that. We want to capitalize on that, and we want to take those lessons forward in what might be a new university setting, a new mode of study, a new approach to learning and teaching in higher education. It would not be right to skip a key concept that many of you will have encountered, which is the synchronous hybrid or HyFlex. By that, I mean a mode of study or an approach to learning and teaching in which the teacher interacts simultaneously with students in the classroom and students remotely. The position at the University of Portsmouth is to avoid HyFlex if we can, and that is the institutional position. We don't have time today to explore this in significant detail, but as a colleague of mine, a very senior deputy vice chancellor at another university told me, sometimes this is necessity, not choice. There is growing literature on the problems associated with this approach. Bringing together those two groups is not always a good thing. It is a very expensive approach in terms of human resource. It is still technically rather tricky, but above all, the experience of learners is not great. When this idea that joining the two communities, the remote and the face-to-face community, that's a fantasy. Really, I have significant reservations on a number of levels about this approach, and my university equally has those reservations. I invite you to look at some of the literature associated with this. This is one example. If you look at the Gartner hype cycle, you will have a number of technologies and approaches here. One of them is, guess what? HyFlex classrooms. Where are they? They are at the peak, at the top of the inflated expectations. Now, what is happening already is this is dropping right down to the trough of disillusionment. That is, frankly, where many of us find ourselves. We should really be critical about embedding these things quickly. We need to think more carefully about this. To conclude, colleagues, a few post-COVID scenarios to consider. If you look at what was happening before, and you look at two axes, synchronicity and proximity, by which I mean physical proximity, you've got low and high in each case. And the main business of campus-based universities was very much the traditional campus-based face-to-face provision. So high proximity, high synchronicity. We were all doing bits of the other quadrants, but particularly our focus was bottom left, high synchronicity, high proximity. Now these things started to change, and indeed did change. Many students during the pandemic, certainly in the UK, were based on the campus in the halls of residence, but they were accessing sessions synchronously or asynchronously. They were accessing sessions from the bedrooms, from the halls of residence, from the rooms. And that was a typical COVID scenario, especially in 2020, 2021, but that extended into 2021, 2022. So again, what does that mean for us? Well, one of the things that we've noticed, and we've got quite a lot of data to support this, is that the levels of physical attendance has dropped massively. Students are not that keen to be in the classroom all the time as they used to. Colleagues are not that keen to be in the classroom all of the time as they used to. And there is this tension between kind of the need to have more contact time in face-to-face format and the need to adjust to a new form of study that seems to be more flexible, more inclusive, more convenient to many students and many colleagues. So that presents us with a number of problems. Some subjects do require significant face-to-face attendance, and we're not getting the levels of attendance we want. What we are noticing clearly is a push on the part of several stakeholders, not only students and staff, for lower proximity and lower synchronicity. Now that means a number of things that we could investigate, that we could discuss on a different day. But for the purposes of today, I would like to put it to you that universities who were typically in the face-to-face space, traditional campus-based, that were operating primarily in that quadrant, they are now being asked and being expected to offer other things. They are expected to shift to the top right of that diagram. That doesn't mean that they should stop doing what they were doing before. What that means is that universities need to do more of all quadrants, and they need to do more, and they need to do it better. Not just as an exceptional case where some courses we are piloting by distance. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that we need to shift the entire culture of traditional campus-based universities away from the traditional face-to-face campus-based provision, because if we do that, then others will be taking our space. We need to move into a wider, more challenging space where we need to do more of all four quadrants. Colleagues, I've covered this plan of activity today. I will pause now. I think I'm about to reach the end of my slot anyway, and I will hand back to our organizers to see if they wish to moderate a few minutes of question and answer. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alejandro Armellini from University of Portsmouth. First, I would like really to thank you for your very insightful lecture. You made an overall contribution and really showed the case that I think we are facing here as a generally traditional University of Ljubljana as well. So many challenges that you have addressed are something that happens to us as well. And we see it basically on a daily basis. We see all the dangers and threats that you have presented, especially when you were talking about the COVID time of emergency teaching and learning and the post-COVID scenarios. Now, I would just like to ask if there are any questions or comments on behalf of our audience. No, not at the time. So I hope that we will be able to use your presentation to look it afterwards because it was really insightful. You've also shown some references to your papers and research work that you have done in this matter. I think it will be very, very useful. And related to the fact that today's workshop or conference, as we call it, where basically our teachers from university are presenting their cases, their experience from COVID, bad and good, to other teachers. I think your lecture was very, very good in terms of an introductory lecture to what the blended learning in the future should really look like. And what you've stressed at the end is not to shift from traditional face-to-face lectures to some completely asynchronous learning, but to do all more. I think this is a message that is very important for our university members and teachers as well. So I would like to thank you very much. In case there will be some other questions afterwards, because things need to lay down and then maybe some questions will be asked, we are going to send it to you by an email and would like to ask you maybe to comment on that if it comes to it. Thank you again for your contribution.